Hi, my name is Paddy Barrett. I'm a cardiologist and a clinician scholar at the Scripps Translational Science Institute in California and a UCD graduate of class of 2005. What I'd like to talk about today is physician burnout. This is something that we all know that exists. We see it around us every day in our clinical practice, in our work, but for some reason there is often this acceptance or lack of acceptance that we don't take it in. We see it around us and we tend not to work on it or to try and improve it. For me, this all came to a head about 2 years ago when I was working in New York City, and within 1 week, 2 of the physicians committed suicide by jumping from the hospital car park. And although that incident in and of itself was quite shocking, it was a later point when I had announced this to a very senior colleague that the second physician had committed suicide, and it was his response that shocked me the most. It wasn't that his response was a callous one or born out of malicious intent, but his response was, well, I suppose it's that time of year, all right. And that simply spoke to the idea that we had accepted that this was going to be a part of the framework of our lives in medicine, and that physicians, as part of this, were going to be casualties in a healthcare system, that they were not being taken care of. So as I began to look into this more and more, this was a piece that came out in Time magazine in August 2015, and it really chronicles the story of several surgical trainees in Stanford. And the piece was Doctors on Life Support, and it caught a huge amount of international attention as to how these surgical trainees were dealing with such incredibly challenging times, and the facilities and supports that were being put in place to try and get them through a really arduous time during their clinical training. For me, I was in New York City at the time, and much like everybody who works in medicine is doing an incredibly meaningful job. But even though you are doing a very meaningful job, for me and for many of my colleagues, we were not getting meaning from our work. So there was a very significant discrepancy here. And for me, it was important that I understood why this was the case. When you look around more, you see it in all the news media outlets. It becomes so apparent when you begin to peel back the layers that this has been a persistent issue for many, many years, and is an issue that is getting increasingly more prevalent, not just in the United States, but worldwide. Objectively, when we look at our roles as physicians, we have so many of the objective characteristics of a very meaningful and fulfilling job. We hold positions, obviously, of prestige. We are generally held in high regard. We get to add value and help other people. We're generally paid quite well. But when you put all these features together, despite them, the reality on the ground tended to be very, very different. And there was a very significant gap between what the potential was and the reality is. And that was my objective, to explore that gap and to see how we could ultimately correct it. Dissatisfaction with your work is one thing, but when that leads to the ultimate culmination of suicide, it becomes a whole other matter entirely. And this was what we were seeing with these 2 physicians within 1 week committing suicide. So the statistics around this are incredibly sobering. When we look in the United States alone, if you were to give a guess in terms of how many physicians commit suicide annually in the United States, you would be really surprised. Because in the United States alone, and this is the lower estimate, 400 physicians commit suicide annually. And when you put that in perspective, that's several graduating classes of medical students every year committing suicide. What I think is a really interesting thought experiment is to think of this picture. And everybody knows this picture because everybody has this picture, and it is their picture of their graduating medical class. When you were with all your friends after many years of hard study and slogging through exams, and you were leaving on that day with huge smiles on your faces and excited about a future. Everybody knows that photo. They probably have it at home somewhere, or it's hung in the hallway of the medical school that you attended or the hospital that you attended. Now imagine every single one of those people, every single one of them, including you, gone. And that's the reality of how big of a challenge we are facing. When we look at these numbers, it's sometimes hard to see them in context. 400, 500 physicians may seem like a lot, but when it's a relative number and how we compare to the general population, we need to look at that in more detail. Is it just us, or is it the population in general and we are just part of it? When we compare ourselves to the general population, a male physician is up to 2.5 times more likely to commit suicide than his age-matched peer, and a female physician is up to 4 times more likely to commit suicide rather than their age-matched peer. So there is something very specific within the physician population that is driving this. One of the things you see within physician suicides is that compared to the general population, we tend not to attempt suicide. We tend to complete suicide. We have far higher completion rates compared to the general population, and the methods that we use to commit suicide are generally very lethal ones. We take drug overdoses knowing what will ultimately kill us and will ultimately not be recoverable, or we use incredibly lethal means. When we look at medical students after road traffic accidents, suicide is the number 2 cause of death. When we look at our surgical colleagues, when you have certain survey data that looks at 1 in 16 of them have at some point during their training expressed suicidal ideation. And that in and of itself is incredibly sobering. But what is even more so is that for those people who express suicidal ideation, only 26% of them sought help. So we had this significant population of surgical trainees who at some point are thinking along the lines of suicidal ideation and not feeling that they can reach out for help. Everybody at some stage may have thought this or know somebody who has said it, but if they feel that they would just have an accident or some form of an injury that would prohibit them from going to work, or that a colleague of mine said that if I just drove into the oncoming traffic, it would make it all just go away. So we have this really significant problem, but part of the problem is ourselves. We as patients are incredibly bad patients. 1 in 3 of us are in a position where we have no regular source of medical care, and we are acting as our own physicians. Although suicide is the end point of all of this and is the point of no return, often it's preceded very much by sets of mental illnesses and other psychological stressors that precede it and can be identified and treated. Everybody knows this physician because everybody was this physician. This is your first day on the floor as a newly qualified doctor with your freshly pressed white coat and a clipboard with pretty much nothing on it except the number to the locker room and the toilets. But very quickly you can see it degenerates into something all of us will recognize, entirely exhausted and very different from our first days. When we look at rates of depression amongst those in internships at the start of their training, we see that there's approximately 3.9% at the start, but when you look at it at the end, again, very sobering. So when we consider what these figures are going to be, we see 3.9 at the start, and at the end, 26% almost. If this was a drug, the FDA would certainly not approve it, but if it was a mouse model for actually designing models of depression, it would be the best out there. And this is the first year of all training for all physicians. When we look at depression amongst our peers, between males and females, the statistics in certain series map out just above the average population, but there is a very large suspicion that this is an underreported figure, that physicians do not want to self-select them or report themselves into this category. When you look at later data, approximately 28% of physicians are reporting at least one characteristic of depressive symptoms, and some of these series would report up to 43%. Ultimately, we're bad patients. We're bad patients not because we wince when someone puts a cannula in. We're bad patients because we never go to the doctor. We're bad patients because we ignore symptoms that we would criticize our patients for ignoring. Ultimately, there's huge stigma around these diseases within the physician population. We are the people who treat diseases. We are not the people who get diseases, particularly not those of mental health. There's huge issues around privacy. If I was to disclose this to anybody, to a colleague, to a psychiatrist, would it be kept secret? Would it become an open piece of information? There are issues around licensing and litigation and how that might feature and factor in future incidents and your ability to become recertified. What tends to underpin all of this, and is a term that so many of us are so frequently aware of and promoted in the media, is this idea of burnout. Now, when you look at the 2015 data on this, the percentage of physicians who report being burnt out, again, incredibly sobering figures. On average, 46%, but depending on the specialty, and generally more frontline care physicians are affected, up to and above 50%. You have very high numbers of people thinking that they wouldn't choose the same career again, or if they did, they certainly wouldn't choose the same specialty again. Obviously, this is cased in the idea that there are green fields far away, but there is definitely a theme here that needs to be paid attention to. One of the big questions is whether this is getting better, worse, or the same. When we look at the change over a 5-year period between 2011 and 2014, we can see that burnout on average in the United States has gone up by approximately 9%, and work-life satisfaction has gone down approximately 8%. Again, is this exclusive to the physician community, or is this something that the whole world is experiencing based on societal change? When you compare it ourselves as physicians to the general population, burnout is twice as likely, and work-life satisfaction scores are on average 32% less. The big question then comes down to, does it matter? And there is an abundance of study data to suggest that it absolutely does. It decreases a whole host of measures of professionalism, of patient satisfaction scores, of patient care parameters. It increases staff turnover, which is incredibly costly for hospital systems, and also increases medical errors. When we look at surgical errors, the idea of the second victim, the first being the patient and the second being the person who actually causes it, who carries that with them for the rest of their career. We know that burnout increases the rates of surgical error in the range of 5 to 11% for every point increase on the burnout scale. The big question then becomes, what is burnout? People talk about it a lot, but they tend not to be able to very fixedly define it. People think that when somebody is burnt out, they become totally dysfunctional, they stay at home and they do not participate. But in reality, most, if not all, physicians who are burnt out are with us every day here at work. We have a history and are notorious for burning the candle at both ends. It's the thing that got us to where we are, but we are very blind in so many ways to so many issues that predispose us to this problem. This prompted me to set up and begin a podcast, The Doctor Paradox, which was about exploring this question and ultimately providing solutions to how we would address it and make lives better for physicians. I've spent the last year interviewing a whole host of physicians who are scientific leaders, who have written extensively about this, who have followed non-traditional or alternative career paths, people who are practicing medicine on the very front line as 100% clinicians, psychologists who study work satisfaction and where we derive fulfillment from, and those who have followed a whole host of variety of different careers, up to and including musicians, doctors who became musicians, or comedians, people who have taken time from their career to trek across the North Pole, physicians who study this exclusively in lab settings, and those who look at a variety of different ways that we cope as human beings. One of the groups that I have looked at is Kate Granger, who I spoke with some months back, who promoted the idea of "Hello, my name is," and she is a physician who, when I spoke with her, was on her 4th round of chemotherapy, and approximately 2 months after the interview, sadly passed away. But she was a huge advocate of the idea of rehumanizing medicine. Our own colleagues here in Ireland, Ronan Kavanagh, who has been a huge advocate of this for quite some time, Liz O'Riordan, who is a breast cancer patient and a breast cancer surgeon, who spoke so candidly about her experience as a doctor and as a patient. So this issue of burnout matters, but as physicians, even though we have very significant degrees of insight to an extent, there are so many things that we are blind to, even knowing all of this. When you ask somebody what burnout is, when you get them to describe it, they find it hard to, even though they feel that they know what it is. It's a very blurry and ill-defined term to a lot of people. But just like being in love, once you see it, you know it. And by virtue of its classic definition, it's a syndrome of 3 cardinal features. The first being emotional exhaustion. And this is not fatigue like you get after a long day's work. This is an exhaustion of physical, emotional, spiritual exhaustion of which you feel that there is no recovery from. Not a good night's sleep, not a full weekend off, not a week away, not some time off will fix this. You feel utterly depleted and holding no reserves. This is not simple tiredness. This is a depletion of all your energy banks. This concept of depersonalization, where we feel entirely separated from our patients, where we feel completely disconnected and almost carrying a callous disregard to our patients. The idea of lack of efficacy, that what we do doesn't make a difference, and the same thing will happen anyway, and that your work really has no purpose. As an acid test, the best way to think about it is this, is that when you see the front door of the hospital and your only thought is that you have to figure out a way to actually walk straight back out that door again, and that everything and everyone who asks you to do something during your day's work is in your way from getting back out that door, and there is a very high likelihood that you're burnt out. The problem is that for so many of these features of our work, we have accepted them as normal, but they're not normal. They just seem to be our referent of what we see around us every day. What I ultimately believe one of the greatest causes in terms of when you look internally, it is the distance between the physician that you are and the physician that you had hoped to be. And when that distance is large, is where dissatisfaction becomes a huge issue. So the question becomes, where do you sit on that scale? Does this sound familiar to you? And how do you score? Now, there are many physicians who come to work and enjoy their work every day and will never have this concern. But for some, that is not the case. When you look at the different specialties who suffer burnout, everyone does 3 things when they look at this. They say, who's at the top, where am I, and bloody dermatology. But even our dermatologist colleagues at the bottom of the burnout scoring scales are still reporting 37%. So even the best are doing quite poor. When you look at survey data as to what is causing burnout, some of these seem very obvious. Too many bureaucratic tasks, working too many hours. But when I began to study this in more detail, you see that something is missing. That the causes that are listed here don't fully account for the degree of impact this is having on our lives. And what changed everything for me was this book by Christina Maslach, who coined the Maslach Burnout Inventory. And she has this book, Cost of Caring, which I would advocate to anybody who works in healthcare to fundamentally understand our blind spots. Her husband, Philip Zimbardo, was the primary investigator for the Stanford Prison experiments and writes the introduction. But what is notable from this book is that the causes of burnout are not singular. There are multitude in nature and all interact with one another. There are generally 6 themes that tend to drive burnout. The first that always gets the most attention is this idea of workload. But in reality, it is often not the strongest predictor of burnout. And a problem, because when we try and fix that and the burnout doesn't get better, we wonder why. And ultimately, workload is when you have a very significant and long-standing imbalance between the demands that are made of you and the resources you have available to meet them. But as I mentioned, this is not the strongest predictor. Other predictors include insufficient rewards and the idea of what rewards you think they should be and what they are, not just around money, but around praise, time off, and a whole host of other features. This idea of a breakdown in community, that we are in survival mode and we are fending for ourselves, and that we feel we are no longer part of something larger than ourselves. This concept of absence of fairness. And we see this even in situations which would be deemed objectively bad. If fairness is maintained, it seems to be okay. But once fairness is lost, people tend to do very poorly. The 2 biggest drivers that I have seen and tend to be supported by the data on this are the idea of value conflicts, whereby you say you did this to help, but ultimately feel that you're not. If you feel that your values are not in sync with the organization with which you work, there is a huge value conflict, and you believe there is a major core conflict with your beliefs, which can drive huge amounts of dissatisfaction. The number 1 feature is a lack of control. It's a lack of control of your time, of your schedule, of the resources you have available to you to fix the problems that are presented, of the environment that exists around you, and importantly, a lack of control of your future, that you feel that you are basically railroading into something very scary and that you have little control over. Ultimately, we have, as physicians, incredible blind spots. Often the person who is burnt out is the last to know. Everybody else around them can point and say, yep, that person is burnt out. But the person who's experiencing it is often the last to know. This concept of pluralistic ignorance, whereby when you are experiencing it and you know that you are, you think you are the only one experiencing it and everybody else is doing just fine. But the reality is everybody else is thinking just like you. So we tend to experience it as individuals and not as a group. The concept of identity of physicians is crucial. Who we are and what we do are so tightly linked. When somebody asks you what you do, you don't say, I work as a doctor. You say, I am a doctor. So who you are and what you do are almost one. But when you begin to dislike what you do, you begin to dislike who you are. And because of that, you carry around this huge guilt. The same as when we look at what we do on a day-to-day basis, we think of as one thing, but in reality it's 2. The core part is the art of medicine, the absolute practice of what we do, those rare and privileged moments when we care for patients. And that is what keeps us doing what we do and motivated us to do all the work that we have done so far. The rest of the stuff that exists around that is our job. That's the rotas, being here at a certain time, the staying up late, all these other features. But we tend to dislike elements of our job and not the art of medicine. And it is crucial to make that distinction, that you will always love the art of medicine, but you can always change elements of your job. And that's an important thing, because when you start to dislike your job, with it you begin to dislike the art of medicine, or at least you think you do. And again, you carry around huge guilt with you each time you do that. So what can be done? The first thing to remember, and this is crucial, is that you can't treat burnout. We are pathology-oriented people. We see a disease, we attempt to treat the person with that disease. Burnout is experienced as an individual, but it is predominantly caused by the ecosystem relationship they have with that individual, with the environment. If you treat the individual, you miss out the opportunity to treat the environment. Now, I'm a fan of contemplative practices, and I think they're hugely important, but when used in isolation, they will be inadequate. Concepts of meditation, yoga, exercising more, sleeping more are important, but when used in isolation, simply won't work, and ironically will enrage people because it does not acknowledge the role of the environment. It simply puts the responsibility on the individual. So we need to take the focus off the individual, and we need to have a greater emphasis on the individual's relationship to their environment and to the system that they exist within. So what should we do? The first thing that needs to happen is there needs to be a very clear acknowledgement from all parties involved, from physicians and those in organizational leadership, that this is an issue that is important and needs to be solved. It involves a very strong degree of collaboration and dialogue between those parties. And importantly, this isn't an us versus them problem. The system that we speak of, the organization that we speak of, is not some other group of nebulous people. It is ourselves. We are part of that organization. We are part of that system. So we need to work collectively and collaboratively to fix this. As a starting point, what I would suggest is you need to figure out for your department, for your division, for your hospital, is this a problem? So you need to take the temperature. You can do this using various tools. The Maslow Burnout Inventory is the most classic tool. And then when you have an understanding of if this is a problem, you can then move on to a root cause analysis to find out what is truly driving it. Survey tools like the Areas of Work-Life Survey will give you estimations of imbalances in the concepts of workload, insufficient rewards, community, fairness, value, and autonomy, and give you a better understanding of what is truly driving the problem within your division or department. When you understand this, now you have a target to aim for and something to work toward, and not simply blindly trying to reduce hours or offering meditation and yoga classes. And this is an iterative process. This continues indefinitely. You take the temperature, you do a root cause analysis, and you provide an intervention, you see if it works, and you repeat the process continually. This doesn't end. For right now, the most important thing that you can take away and the most important thing that you need to acquire is insight, insight, insight. It is our blindness as physicians to so many of the key elements that makes us so susceptible to this problem. What I would suggest as resources to take away immediately, Burnout by Christina Masloch is a game-changing book, and so is Dyke Drummond's book, Stop Physician Burnout. Both of these will change your perspective on burnout immensely. As a first step, you can look at the AMA Steps Forward program. Just type that into Google and they provide a series of PDFs on preventing and treating burnout. Importantly, leadership matters here. And everybody is in a leadership role. It doesn't matter what stage you're at. What matters is that people think that someone actually cared about them. Often they don't have to change the environment, but if they have a perspective, and that is a genuine perspective that someone cared, it makes a huge difference. So sit down and have a coffee with somebody whom you feel like you need to have a conversation with. It doesn't need to be about burnout, but all it needs to express is a feeling that you actually cared about the welfare of another person on your team. This isn't a simple problem fix, but the alternative is quite scary. And I think all of us have sat in this chair. This is the front cover of the National Geographic of Poland's first heart transplant. And we've all been here on this chair, caught between privilege and despair. We see the importance of what we do, but also the importance of why we should fix it. Thank you.